About 6 years ago, I was at Ramana Ashram in Tiruvannamalai in southern India, the place where the great non-dual saint and teacher Ramana Maharshi spent the largest bulk of his life. And I found myself, it felt like called to this place through a strange series of promptings that came from different friends and synchronicities that I couldn't ignore. And I had been staying in southern India at Shantivanam, which is a Roman Catholic ashram, where Father Bede Griffiths spent the last half of his life, and he had worked to integrate deeply in his heart Hinduism and Christianity. And so after these various promptings, I finally decided one afternoon that it was time to go to Tiruvannamalai and to go to Ramana. So I made up my mind that the next morning I would find a way to leave the ashram and make it to Tiruvannamalai. And I didn't know how I was going to get there. I just knew that it was time to go. And that same night, a van showed up at the ashram that was carrying a group of ministers who told me that the next morning they were driving to Tiruvannamalai and they had one seat left in their van. So I took the hint and I went with them. And once there, I spent time studying the teachings of Ramana, and I found in myself simultaneously this powerful pull to what he was teaching, what he was laying out, and also this inner push, this tension in myself. And working with Ramana's self-inquiry, I had one of the most profound non-dual seeings of my life, asking the question, who am I? And eventually, the whole rational, dualistic apparatus of my brain just kind of shut down. And I looked at a stranger and literally saw them as myself, and saw that there was no I, there was no separation, and we were just these two poles within a single reality. And the seeing lasted for a few seconds, and it felt timeless. And then I was back suddenly in my limited self with my old lines and my old boundaries, and everything was as it had been. And so I knew in some profound way, if just through this little glimpse, the truth of what Ramana was saying. And at the same time, I found myself profoundly uncomfortable with his constant teaching, you are not the body. You are not the body. I might not only be the body, I might not be limited to the body, but I am this body, something in me kept saying. There's something profoundly important about our manifestation in these forms. So the next morning, I got up and I made the trek up Arunachala, the sacred mountain there, and I listened to a monk chant his morning prayers on the mountain, and I kept feeling this sense of disconnect from what seemed like this profoundly otherworldly spirituality. And something prompted me to not walk down the mountain the way I'd come, but to walk down the other side. And I wound up coming down the mountain right into the center of town. And I was surrounded by the colors and the smells of the marketplace, by children running around playing, by an elephant in the temple courtyard, and everything was just bursting with life and with color. And I had this overwhelming sense that this was where God was happening, in the hustle and bustle of the marketplace. That God had poured God's self out into matter as matter to know God's self through the diversity and the beauty and the richness of creation. And after this, I made my way back to the ashram, back to the quiet side of the mountain, and I wandered into the library looking for a book. And I was certainly not looking for a Christian book, something on Hinduism, maybe Buddhism, but my eye, almost against my will, fell on the spine of a title that said, The Hymn of the Universe by Teilhard de Chardin. And so I pulled the book off the shelf and began devouring it. Teilhard was a French Jesuit and a paleontologist who was born in 1881, and he died in 1955. And over the course of his life as a priest and a scientist, he worked to integrate evolutionary vision with his Christian theology and mysticism. And what I found in this book was a profound love of matter and of the body and of form and of the manifest world. And it was the perfect balance that I so desperately needed to complement Ramana's teachings. And Teilhard wrote in this book, He wrote of finding himself in the steppes of Asia, and he didn't have bread or wine or an altar to celebrate the Mass. And so he writes, "I will raise myself beyond these symbols, up to the pure majesty of the real itself. I, your priest, will make the whole earth my altar, and on it will offer you all the labors and sufferings of the world. Over every living thing which is to spring up, to grow, to flower, to ripen during this day, say again the words, 'This is my body.' And over every death force which waits in readiness to wither, to cut down, speak again your words which express the supreme mystery of faith. 'This is my blood.'" And he wrote, "For me, my God, all joy and all achievement, the very purpose of my being, and all my love of life, all depend on this one basic vision of the union between yourself and the universe. Let others, fulfilling a function more august than mine, proclaim your splendors as pure spirit. As for me, dominated as I am by a vocation which springs from the innermost fibers of my being, I have no desire, no ability to proclaim anything except the innumerable prolongations of your incarnate being in the world of matter." I love that phrase, the innumerable prolongations of your incarnate being in the world of matter. "I can only preach the mystery of your flesh, you, the soul shining forth through all that surrounds me." Needless to say, my heart was singing at this. This was not a non-duality that said the world is illusion, that said you are not the body. This was a non-duality that said you are the body of God. And now I imagine some of you, maybe most of you, have felt this tension before, tension between a spirituality that feels like it's about swimming back upstream to some clarified, rarefied, non-dual awakening that has little to do with the world or your body, and a spirituality that's about fully embracing all that is, and importantly, all that is becoming. And I think Teilhard is one of our voices that holds the critical missing piece that most of us are catching on to today, which is an evolutionary worldview. In a static universe, or worse, as some traditions put it, in a degenerative universe, it makes perfect sense that the goal of the spiritual journey is to swim back upstream to God. But in an evolving and converging universe, the goal is to drive the whole creation forward toward what is becoming, toward what is trying to come into form. This amazing sense that the divine heart is longing through the evolutionary process to express itself more and more fully through the world of matter. Teilhard felt the tension in himself between the classical mystical pull towards the absolute and between his deep love for matter and the earth. And he found that this upward movement, this upward current, and then this downward current towards the world were reconciled in a forward movement. So upward and downward come together in the forward. And this is the tension that I think we live in right now as we enter what I called in the abstract for this talk, the second axial age. Now, are any of you familiar with this axial terminology? So it's a term that comes from a historian, Karl Jaspers, and he used it to identify a window in human history and planetary history during which the headwaters of all of our great religious traditions began forming around the world. So simultaneously, seemingly independently around the planet, we had Lao Tzu teaching the way of the Tao in China. We had the Buddha with his great awakening. We had the seers of the Upanishads teaching self-realization. We had the Hebrew prophets preaching social justice and monotheism. All of this starts happening concurrently around the planet. And it represented a planetary shift in spiritual understanding. So up until this point, spirituality had been largely earth-based. So we found our original gods in the cycles and seasons and forces of nature. And identity up until this point had been primarily collective. It was held in the tribe. So with this axial shift, something new opened. We opened up to the possibility of the transcendent. to the possibility of an individual spiritual quest for salvation or enlightenment that could allow us to break ties with family, with tribe, and it became a noble thing. So you can think of, as an example, the Buddha, who left his wife and his child in the palace to go off in search of enlightenment. He could break those ties. Or Abraham and Sarah in the Hebrew Scriptures, who broke ties with their tribal gods and their tribal family and went off in search of the one. So this is when we started seeing the emergence of monastic orders, these people who could break ties with earth and family and go off in search of transcendent enlightenment. And so what was lost in this shift was, again, a sense of collective identity and a deep felt sense of connection to the earth. And salvation or enlightenment began to look an awful lot like escape. There was a profound sense that there was something wrong with the phenomenal world. In the West, it was talked about as fallenness and as sin. In the East, it was talked about suffering and samsara. But however it was framed, something was wrong, and the ultimate goal was to get out of here, to attain to the heavenly prize or to escape the cycle of death and rebirth. And now, we're faced with a shift that's reorienting that whole understanding. Today, more than ever, we've got a profound sense of the interconnection of all life around the planet, a profound sense that we belong to the planet and that we belong to each other. And you don't need to be a mystic to get this. It's coming at us from every field of knowledge, from physics that are revealing the interconnections at the most subtle levels of matter, from our environmental and ecological awareness that are telling us everything's part of a single web of life. If you tug on one strand, the whole web moves. To our increased technology, that we can travel around the planet, that we can connect with each other through the internet, that we can video chat with someone through a smartphone in our hand on the other side of the planet. So this profound sense of interconnection and belonging. And many thinkers tell us that in the light of the shift that's happening, we're entering now essentially a second axial age, a second shift, a second global shift in consciousness that is again transforming human spirituality and human religion in a way that's equal in weight and importance to the first shift that actually produced the existing religions. And what's happening, we're actually picking up everything that we lost in that first axial shift. That profound earthiness and connection to our bodies, that deep sense of a collective identity, we're picking all of that back up, but not at the same level, not at the tribal level. We're picking it up now at the global level. We're one tribe, we're one human family, one planet Earth. And while our ancestors may have opened this door to the transcendent as a means of escape, I think what we're finding is that they were really opening this door so that the transcendent could flow more fully into this realm and inform and evolve this realm, not so that we could escape from this world. So, again, it comes back to that whole movement of uniting the upward movement towards spirit, the downward movement towards matter, and this forward movement, this evolving current. And so we're actually in this time of binding together heaven and earth, you could say, of binding together the immanent and the transcendent, of spirit and body, of time and eternity. We're weaving them together. And so salvation or enlightenment or awakening all begin to look a little different. We realize that we can't leave this earth or our bodies or each other behind in the process. We will either awaken together, hand in hand, or not at all. And the stirrings of this understanding are already present in our spiritual lineages. For the longest time, scholars lumped Christianity and Islam in with the first axial religions, even though they were actually formed well after that first axial window. But what I want to suggest is that they, along with other currents emerging in the other spiritual lineages, were actually the first stirrings of second axial consciousness. So Christianity, for example, has always rested uneasily with those first axial roadmaps, although again and again we've roped it back into them. If you look at its most basic doctrine of the incarnation, there's this profound sense of embracing the phenomenal world. For God so loved the world that the Word became flesh. So this profound sense of divinity in matter and in body. And I wonder if this might be the very reason that Christianity for so long rested uneasily with and sometimes suppressed its own mystical tradition, because it feared the otherworldly path of ascent that seemed to be embedded in much of those mystical currents. And although you hear contemporary Christians speak about their personal Lord and Savior, the New Testament image has always been one of collective awakening, an emerging, expanding, organic body of Christ into which individuals are incorporated. St. Paul spoke of the whole creation groaning in labor pains as it worked to bring forth something new. He wrote, "I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us." So again, there's this profound sense of forward movement, that the manifest world is moving towards something and that it's not to be escaped from or rejected. And we see the same understanding at almost the same time in the life of the planet emerging in Buddhism with the rise of the Bodhisattva vow. So the ideal in that shift became no longer individual enlightenment and total extinguishment in nirvana, but instead a pledge to forswear that final dissolution and to remain in the phenomenal world working for the collective awakening of all beings. So again, a shift from the individual and escape to the collective and belonging. The same thing in Islam. We see the contemplative and the monastic impulse transformed profoundly in the Sufi orders into a this worldly embrace of life. So Sufism is the mystical tradition within Islam, and it never arranged itself into celibate monastic communities. It actually insisted that the contemplative current and work remain integrated into life in the world. And it modeled itself on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who was a husband and a businessman and a father and a lover. And so they said, this current has to stay in the life of the world. So the second axial current has been stirring for some time. And now with our emergence as a global humanity, it's finally coming into its own. And Teilhard de Chardin, working from within the Christian tradition, he saw this so very clearly, and he framed it within evolutionary terms. So he stepped back and he looked at the evolution of the planet. He saw first the emergence of a geosphere, so the planet itself. And then he saw around that the emergence of a biosphere, so a sphere of life around the planet. And then he saw the emergence of what he called a noosphere. And nous is the Greek word for mind, so the emergence of a layer of mind, of conscious awareness around the planet. And Teilhard actually interpreted the work of Jesus as initiating a new phylum of love within the noosphere that would help make the next evolutionary leap. And Teilhard called this leap the Christification of the human species. So this idea that the whole species is to become Christified. And he saw the whole thing moving towards a convergence, moving towards what he called Christ Omega, or the Omega point. So the deeply personal, intimate, non-dual center of the universe, what we might call the heart of God, for Teilhard, this was revealed in the person of Jesus. And he saw that the same point was the point of convergence towards which humanity was moving. So he turned again to the words of St. Paul to understand this. Paul writes, "With all wisdom and insight, God has made known to us the mystery of God's will, a plan for the fullness of time to gather up all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on earth." So again, this binding together of the earthly and the heavenly, of the spiritual and the material, and all converging. And Teilhard identified this convergence with what's traditionally in the Christian tradition been called the second coming of Christ, Christ coming in fullness and glory through the noosphere of the planet as humanity fully awakens. And when he stepped back and looked at the trajectory of evolution, he saw that this movement towards convergence was inevitable. And he saw that initially we had followed what he called a process of divergence. So around the planet, as the human species fanned out around the globe, we developed different lines of evolution. We evolved different tribes, different languages, different religions, different cultures. But because of the simple fact of the spherical shape of the planet and its limited surface area and the growing human population, eventually divergence would reach a necessary end and a process of convergence would be initiated. So all these divergent lines of religion and culture and race and tribe would begin converging around the globe. And so here we are at that moment in human history, waking up as a single human family. And what we're discovering, particularly in relation to our religious and our spiritual traditions, is that all of them belong to all of us. If we're truly one human family, then our spiritual traditions, our religious traditions, are our shared spiritual resources. They're our collective spiritual inheritance as members of this one human family. So we can't say that the Enlightenment and the teachings of the Buddha belong to a group over here called the Buddhists. We can't say that the teachings of Jesus belong to a group over here called Christians. No, all of them belong to all of us. Jesus is a universal human treasure. Muhammad is a universal human treasure. The Buddha is a universal human treasure. And these treasures have been held in trust by specific spiritual lineages, but they're the inheritance of the whole human family. And we can begin to think of the religions not as the paths of return to God, the paths flowing back upstream to God, but rather as the paths flowing out from God, as God comes into form in the world. In the Christian tradition, I think we could do no better than to expand St. Paul's metaphor, his image of the body of Christ, to its most cosmic and most universal dimensions, seeing it as the awakening body of the human family, seeing it as Teilhard termed it, this growing phylum of love within the planet. And Paul writes that in a body, an eye cannot say to a foot, I have no need of you. The hand cannot say to the head, I have no need of you. And in the same way today, as we awaken as a single planetary body, Hindu cannot say to Muslim, I have no need of you. Christian cannot say to Buddhist, I have no need of you. Israeli and Palestinian cannot say to one another, I have no need of you. Our awakening will either be hand in hand, all together, or not at all. We're being invited today to form a new body, a higher collectivity than we have ever seen expressed before in human history. When we look at the formation of a molecule, let's say H2O, you have these two independent H's and an independent O, and they come together and form something new, H2O. And in the process, they give up something of their autonomy and independence to become a part of something higher, to become a part of a new body, a new level of complexity in the evolutionary unfolding. At the same time, though, none of their individuality is lost. It's all caught up into the new thing. And that, I think, is what we're being invited to do today as a human species. We're being invited to be caught up beyond our old lines and boundaries of division into something new. One of my Christian teachers likes to say that we need to get rid of all of those bumper stickers that say coexist and replace them with ones that say coalesce. We have to become conscious cells in a single body. Teilhard wrote towards the end of his life, I can see quite clearly that the reason I can have influence does not come at all from what I have invented, whatever that may be, but simply from the fact that I have found myself resonating in the right way to a certain vibration, a certain human and religious note, which is now in the air everywhere. May we all start to resonate to this note. And may this new body that's coming into being, this higher person, this new collectivity, this true human being be born. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
What do you see as the role of religion and specifically evangelical communities or church communities in
Right.
this coalescing?
Yeah. I think the religions importantly hold the spiritual resources that we need for transformation. So contemplative practices, community, ritual, sacred language, all of those gifts and resources that we need, they're present in the traditional religious bodies. And we can work to create those outside of the traditional religious forms, but that can be hard work and everyone isn't called to it. I have a sense that we really need people serving in 3 different places today. We need people who are working within the religious forms to deepen them and evolve and expand them, and to make sure that their blessings and their practices flow forward as resources for the human family. And so I think some people are called to stand there. At the same time, we need people who are working outside of the traditions. Some people have been so burned by a tradition that they can't find a home there now. And so we need people creating integral spiritual spaces outside of the old forms. And then we need people who are bridges back and forth between those two. So that's my sense, is that we actually need the religious forms and we need the communities to serve humanity and human awakening. And in some ways, they're the safest places to do it because they have the checks and balances in place. If they can just shuck off their old superiority complexes, do that work and become permeable to each other. So did that answer? Yeah. Anybody else?
Yes, how do we form a truly planetary set of religion? So how can we have planetary Judaism,
Right.
planetary Hinduism, planetary Christianity, planetary Islam, planetary Buddhism, planetary humanism,
Mm-hmm.
all of course converging in mystical reality.
Unity.
Whatever you want to say. But how do we go about planetizing each of the traditions? And, it's accelerated convergence. In other words, where in any one tradition you get the whole
Mm-hmm.
reflected in that tradition, and that tradition reflected in every other tradition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we just do it. I mean, those who are planted in the traditions can continue serving out of the traditions in this really permeable, open way. And it's the people who are planted there who are going to do it. The people who are planted outside of the traditions are going to do it there. So that's not much of an answer, but I think we do it. And then as we form friendships across traditions, that also serves what's emerging. And we see people today with hybrid identities, that they stand in multiple traditions, and I think that's something to be celebrated because it's actually speeding up the convergence. We often put folks like that down. We talk about buffet Buddhists and cafeteria Catholics, and that it's just pick and choose religion. And it's a risk that, and teachers who say you have to choose one well and go deep, they're onto something, because we can do this shallow surface skimming, and when we hit something difficult in our tradition, then we just jump over to another tradition and we never actually do the hard spiritual work. At the same time, a Swami said to me a while back, a Ramakrishna monk, he said, but there's a difference between digging 15 shallow wells and using 15 tools to dig one well. And so as we start to see these as shared resources across the traditions, we can work together. So yeah, I think it's for people called to stay in the traditions to stay in them and to help them stretch, expand, become more permeable.
I have a second question, if I may. Are we building, is Spirit building a new world living for us?
I don't think we know where it's going because it's becoming through us. It's in process. So we can't look ahead and see what the end result is. The term interspirituality, which was coined by Brother Wayne Teasdale, who was a Roman Catholic lay monk, he said that he intended it to mean the sharing of spiritual resources across traditions and a willingness to touch and taste the mystical depth in another tradition. And he said he didn't intend it to mean a synthesis of the existing religions or a new religion. And I think that the diversity of the traditions can continue to serve a function, just like the different organs in a body continue to serve a function. So I don't think they all have to dissolve into something new. Doesn't mean that they won't. I think we live into it.
Could it be a single garden?
A single garden, right.
Many species of flowers.
Absolutely. And I think both metaphors work. I remember Thich Nhat Hanh saying once, he was at a Buddhist Christian dialogue, and one of the Roman Catholics, I think a bishop or someone said, we're not here to make a fruit salad. We're here to honor the difference of our traditions. And Thich Nhat Hanh stood up and he told the story of receiving communion from, I think, Daniel Berrigan. And he said, why not? Fruit salad can be delicious. So I think it's a both and.
I'm wondering if all of the interfaith cooperation that we see now between different religions is that first step towards what you're talking about here, this axial
Mm-hmm.
reality. And we see this happening in our time, and we're moving in that direction.
Right.
But I'm wondering how long will it take? If you ask yourself this question, how long will it take before we reach a place where it's confidence, where
Yeah.
it's coming from where everyone would share this?
I have no idea, but I know that when we reach a collective threshold as a species, things speed up. So you look at how long slavery existed in human history, and then when there was a shift, the whole system was undone pretty rapidly. Not that slavery is abolished throughout the planet, but you look at the civil rights movement and within American history, how fast it turned. And the same with LGBT rights today. You see how quickly that shift is happening once it reaches a critical threshold. So I don't know, but I think we are at some kind of threshold in relation to the family of religions.
Another question, have you given any thought to how some, perhaps most people in the world of religion get entrenched
Mm-hmm.
on their own religion
Yeah.
as the only value, and are unable to look at the other?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes spiritual maturity to begin to look at the other. Do you see churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., evolving to a place where the membership, where a majority can grow maturely? If that's a real possibility, is it something that will take another 100, 200 years? Because I think Matthew, Richard Rohr,
Yeah.
writes about different levels of spiritual maturity. And in regards to the church, he says that most are on a scale of 1 to 9, most are either 1 or 2.
Yeah.
Which is not very encouraging. It's not very encouraging. And at best, you can move people one level
Mm-hmm.
their entire lifetime. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this entrenchment
Yeah.
of more fundamentalist type religious people.
I think that the nature of the planetary convergence that we're experiencing through globalization, that itself is eroding the entrenchment. As people, I think people, my generation, but even more significantly, people younger than me, they're growing up with so much diversity, and they're growing up with people of so many different traditions in their high school, and that they don't have as much patience for these kinds of divisions. And so I think in some ways it's kind of just naturally falling away. I do think contemplative practice helps open the heart and, blur and expand the boundaries. And so the more the traditions can hold space for contemplative practice and can encourage that helps. So yeah, the traditions have to rewrite their narratives, their sacred narratives, their mythos in a way that it's big enough to hold the whole of reality that we're facing now. And that's part of the problem with the traditions, is that they don't offer a compelling, coherent narrative that holds everything coming at us today. And that's why so many people, I think, are turning away from them. And if they can reframe themselves, like Teilhard, for example, reframed Christianity beautifully within an evolutionary worldview, still using the sacred images and language of the tradition, then people might see them as legitimate paths of transformation that they want to be a part of. But either the religions will slowly die off because they're not serving anymore, and it's I've heard the image of a nurse log. Do you know that image? A nurse tree? So it's a grand old tree in the forest that falls down, and as it decomposes, it becomes a seedbed for new life to emerge from. And so that's one possibility for the religions, that they're going to become nurse logs, that the wealth, the nutrients, the resources, that something new will spring out of that as they fall over. Or the religions will transform and they'll actually become something new. But my hope is that religious congregations and communities can actually serve this, that they can hold space. And Ken Wilber talks about the possibility of the religions becoming conveyor belts that actually move people further along. And too often they've become the opposite. They install a ceiling that only lets people progress this far, and they're kind of held in. So we've got to blow the ceiling off of the religions.
Majority of people, 70% of the world, just follow the leaders,
Yeah.
including the churches. So unless there is a transformation within the leadership,
Mm-hmm.
each religion, the majority of people will just be stagnant and
Sure.
fundamental, very exclusive territory. Power is the only way. So how can we bring about transformation within the leadership of all major religious traditions? Any thoughts?
It's such a huge question, and we need to, I know in the Christian tradition, we need to completely restructure seminary education. We need to put contemplative practice and spiritual transformation at the heart of the curriculum, so that it's not just a 3-year professional degree where church history is dumped into your head and it's about information. If you look at other traditions, some other traditions, leadership comes out of your own teacher acknowledging your maturity through years of sitting on the cushion or doing your practice, that you've actually reached some depth in your practice. So a Sufi sheikh, their master has appointed them as a successor, a roshi, a guru. There's that chain of transmission. In Christianity, you go get a 3-year degree, in a Western academic, rational-minded approach to education. So that's all got to be transformed. But at the same time, I don't know that it's just going to come from changing the leadership. It is important to change the leadership, but I think so much of it's grassroots, and it's coming from the lay people in Christian terminology. It's coming from the people. It's the people who aren't going to seminaries, but that are reading books and coming to conferences like this and putting in their practice time. I think they may change the religions from the bottom up.
I love this talk. I just read your little piece and I just had to come. It's really important. And I think and I do a little teaching starting with it that I've had from the Lord, this is where it's going. And this is a way of, for me, it's like, oh, it's goody, it's a context.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of say, this is about what's happening. It's just a way of saying it differently. Because I think there's it used to be that the light was coming from up here.
Yes.
I heard somebody say it was like a waterfall coming down from Aguru or Atumajisa or
Mm-hmm.
Buddha or
Right.
like a river instead of like a waterfall, so it's like each to the other. And so that's how it's gonna, it's people, it's these little lights are happening all over the
Yeah.
planet. So this hierarchy, it just can't stand anymore. It's wrong.
Yeah, we have to, like you said, provide a context and a new story. Because once we have a narrative that names what's happening, once we create a roadmap and we say, okay, we see this convergence, then people can get on board with this new story. And our map may not be entirely accurate, but at least it gives us some sense of where we're going.
Picture, I
Yeah.
did a whole poster presentation and it was all visual.
We are out of time.
I gotta go see my poster.
The last thing, though, I'll say is, Thich Nhat Hanh says the next Buddha will be the Sangha, that it's not going to be an individual, it's going to be the collective. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.